the screen sharing so we can just have a conversation to start.
Nice. Awesome. So we've got Chandrea Mar. I hope I'm saying that right. Chandrea. We are also very super excited. Thank you for joining.
No pressure.
A lot of people are super excited.
Yeah, a lot of people are messaging me like, when is it going live? How do I access it?
Okay. It was having a problem syncing with LinkedIn, but I think we're live now. Yeah, looks like we're live. Awesome, cool. So thanks for joining, everyone. It'd be great if you just say hi in the comments so we know who's here. It's easy to see who's here if we get comments on the screen.
Yeah.
So it's 6:07. We'll start in about 3 minutes. For the guys that are live with us, maybe you just want to do a brief intro, Andrew, and then we'll jump to your presentation.
It's getting dark here in South Africa.
Yeah, I've got like 3 lights to make sure it's bright. Yeah,
I've got a few, hopefully my camera battery lasts this time.
Or your web mic.
My camera.
Webcam.
I think that was the problem last time. It was running low, so I made sure it's 100%.
Nice. Cool. Awesome. Got Ryan with us, Nikita. Welcome. Fadziso.
Charu, Matthew, Dion.
Awesome. So thanks.
I was telling friends of mine that this was happening, and they're like, "Don't people have anything better to do on a Friday night?" Like, we're passionate about our work.
Exactly, right? This is the new Friday drinks.
Exactly, man. We used to do this stuff in person, but now it's all digital here.
And it's all global. So
true. I was going through the attendee list, and it is definitely a global audience. Hopefully, a lot of those people join.
Awesome. I mean, it's amazing that we've got quite a varied people from varied backgrounds. So like we've got product owners, designers, technologists. So it's a nice mix of people.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. Again, no pressure. I can only share what I know. So yeah, I'm excited. It's like our last conversation was super rad. That could have gone on for ages. So I'm keen to dive into a little more of the nuts and the bolts. It's quite interesting to see this week already. Like I've worked on some stuff for Omnia. I work for Omnia, a company in Dubai. I'm based out of South Africa, for those that don't know, as the practice lead for the design systems. Currently working on a couple of projects. Abu Dhabi government building out a system for all of their sort of subsidiaries within the government. It's like 170 different platforms. So that's quite a system. And to support that, it's actually not too bad because we're dealing with sort of like the high level in the government, and then from that project we're going to build subsystems to support everything else. But again, it's like they have a lot of different properties, web properties and stuff, and apps, and so it's building out a pretty robust system to support all of that. And that's kind of led me down the path of, okay, how do we do this thing, smartly, and actually get that, what we'll discuss today, that end-to-end sort of product system versus just design.
And the government is an interesting one because they've got like a really heavy emphasis on accessibility. I'm sure you're seeing a lot of that.
Yeah. So again, it's not just some components in a library. There's a lot of thinking around, how does this impact accessibility, different languages, different audiences, different clients. It's
Right.
it's quite vast. And then so that's kind of led me to start working on like an internal system at Omnia. Call it like a material design or whatever, but basically a system that we can use internally to help support us in our projects from a foundation perspective. But again, like what I'm passionate about is that end-to-end design through to production code. When we talk about design systems, Brad Frost and I are having a bit of a debate about design systems versus product systems. And
we're on Twitter.
Yeah.
Those are some heavy hitters, man. Like every design system presentation I've seen references Brad. So
yeah, today will as well.
He's
my man.
Just segue into that. So I think we've got enough people online. So I'll just make you share your screen and over to you.
Awesome. Ishmael, I see that comment. It's got nothing to do with SAP at all, thankfully. But we could. Okay.
So how do you want to do this, Andrew? Do you want people to ask questions while we're doing it and then you'll answer as we go along, or?
Yeah, so I'm pretty flexible. Like I prefer having conversations versus like me just speaking. Again, this is it's a little bit loose today because a lot of it's changed in this last week, and I'm quite excited to show you kind of what I've been working on and what I was able to yesterday finally get working properly. So it'll hopefully show some exciting things for the future and maybe open up mindsets to how design systems can be used and should maybe be used. So yeah, I'll dive in and then you can stop me as and when.
Perfect. Let's go.
Sweet. Let me share my screen here. Sorry, I haven't really used this product before, so hopefully this all works well.
Here we go.
Sweet. I think it's all up. So I'm going to stay in this mode. I'm not going into full presenter mode, so you can kind of track where we're going with this. So as I've said, I work for a company in Dubai called Omnia. We are open for growth. We were doing some pretty awesome work in banking and in government and property and stuff. We're a branding agency, a consultancy. And yeah, we've got great people and we've got great projects. We are on the look for resource. So if you're keen to move to Dubai or potentially be remote, depending on skill set, we'd love to chat. So definitely reach out after this. So my name is Andrew Fehrsen. I'm currently the practice lead for Omnia Design Systems. I'm a part-time athlete focused on triathlon. Well, not really at the moment, more cycling and running, but work's had me pretty busy for a while. I have a very squint cat and his name's Tom. And if you didn't believe me, that's Tom the cat with his very squint eyes. He's a Burmese and he has an impressive skill that he can look at two things at once. But yeah, it's a funny story. I actually got him for my wife for a birthday present one year, and him and I bonded in the car, and he's become my cat, which is pretty awesome. She acted against me. Yeah, so I'm a designer turned technologist. Started in design, print design, then digital design, moved into front end, fell in love with front end dev. And that's kind of led me to where I am today. I'm super passionate about end-to-end product cycles. I've been in design systems for 6 years. Recently left a bank in South Africa called Nedbank, where I built and led the design system team there for 6 years, which has led me to where I am today. So design systems, this is kind of why we're all here today, right? So as I was saying, Bati, and I'm keen to keep this as a conversation as I keep talking, so feel free to jump in. Brad Frost and I are kind of chatting a bit about this in terms of design systems versus product systems. And, the problem with whenever something's labeled with a specific term, then people have this mindset or understanding of what this thing should be or could be. And especially stakeholders within organizations, they hear the word design systems and they just think it's a design thing. And that's not the case, right? So I've got a big drive at the moment to kind of move this into product systems. And yeah, we can discuss a little bit later, but Brad, and rightly so, they predominantly are design systems and they focus around design systems. But from my experience, that word design just creates a lot of issues at organizations who don't understand this process. So when we start to talk about product, they understand that, you know, product includes technology, design, business, influence. Product, you know, speaks to the clients, the users. Design can be quite isolating as a term. So what are design or product systems? Those who are online who worked at Nedbank with me or still at Nedbank would have seen some of the stuff in my masterclass last year. But some people think, you know, a style guide is a design system, or a UI kit is a design system, or a design library is a design system, or maybe a UI pattern library, or some UX guidelines, or, you know, a tech component library. And all of these things are great and very valuable within design systems or product systems. But a product system combines multiple or all of these separate elements, and sometimes even more. As technology grows, as the landscape grows, the things are kind of being added all the time. But, you know, a design system or a product system is a combination of all of these and many things. And like I said, I want to focus on the technology side of things because that's where I'm passionate about. You know, it's not a very, this might be taken in a bad light, but users don't interact with your designs. They interact with the technology that kind of builds those designs out. And I'm not taking anything away from design here. But if technology isn't built correctly, and if the technology isn't up to the standard of the design, that user experience can be broken quite quickly. So as we said, Brad Frost, my man crush when it comes to design systems.
You and me both, right?
I've had the privilege of actually spending some time with him a couple of times. He came out to a conference called Pixel Up in South Africa. So I actually got a signed autographed copy of his book, Atomic Design. But yeah, Brad's Atomic Design is a book that, you know, doesn't sort of have anything new in it. It's just the way that he's kind of presented the thinking. This thinking's been around for a very long time. But I'm sure we all know, you know, the atomic principles in terms of atoms making molecules, making organisms that lead to templates and pages. But why I wanted to touch on atomic design is not so much the principles, but that even in, you know, the first edition of this book, that Brad was already looking at sort of the product side of things in terms of templates and pages versus just design. And at the end of the day, the product is what our users use, as I said before, not just the elements of design that make up that product. And technology greatly influences all the products that we work on. So like something that I've been working over, and this we'll kind of get into the nuts and bolts of this, is like sort of the product system tool chain. And that kind of looks like this for me at the moment, where, you know, we start in design. Figma used to be Sketch for us at Nedbank, and then design and dev integration. So something that I've been working with is the Figma API, which is amazing, and Sketch needs to wake up and learn a lot in terms of the stuff. And then a tool called Figmagic that's been built by an awesome developer, which we'll get into that a little bit later. And then the next stage is sort of local development, and I've just got, you know, Visual Studio Code as a code editor, Git in terms of source control. Then what Brad Frost likes to call the storefront. I'm currently using Storybook. We use Storybook at Nedbank, but you could use Pattern Lab. You could use things like Fractal.build, which we initially used at Nedbank. But basically, the storefront is a place for UI elements to be built out in code, but that isn't tied to sort of the organization or the product code base where you currently work or are involved in. You know, often the case is you work it or you chat to people about their design system in their company, and they've got these components that have been built out that are tied to sort of their design library in some form. But generally, the developers are used to working in a production environment from a code base, and that's kind of where they start. Where I think, you know, that's a bit of a failing. The whole idea is for UI elements, for design elements to be built in terms of like presentational front-end components. rapidly, quickly, not tied to databases, not tied to an environment, etc., that can be tested, commented on, updated quite rapidly and iteratively. And then basically taking those UI components, taking them across to what we'll call later, the reference later as sort of the back of front-end developers, to kind of tie those components into production code, databases, all of that stuff. And then basically into the application that you're working on. So as I was leading to, not all engineers are made for design systems. Not all engineers are made for front end. This is can be quite not PC in my world. But not all developers are equal, and not all developers should be equal. We've all heard the term full stack developer, JavaScript developer, Angular developer, React developer, web developer, front end developer. And like my biggest bugbear is full stack developer. It's like the unicorn that doesn't actually exist, but everyone claims to be. And this sort of engineers aren't, not all engineers are made for design systems. Again, comes from Brad Frost, where he makes this very clear definition between sort of the front of front end and the back of front end, which I 100% agree with and am aligned to. So basically, front of front end is what most of us would consider sort of UI focused developers. And the problem is a lot of people, there aren't a lot of these people anymore, because everyone's become these unicorns that, you know, are full stack, Angular, React, whatever, PHP developers. And the unfortunate side of that is like the back of front end, as Brad refers to it, is quite intensive from a brain perspective and an actually implementation perspective. That then takes most of your focus as a developer rather than the UI and the sort of functional front end stuff. Not functional, the design orientated front end stuff. And it's super critical, in my opinion and Brad's opinion, to have the separation. I've said this a lot while I was at Nedbank. You know, a lot of developers have moved into this sort of front-end developer space from back-end development, specifically on the JavaScript framework side, because it is more sort of data-orientated and functional-orientated. So got a lot of Java developers, PHP developers, .NET developers coming into this space. And they're considered front-end developers, but they're not really front-end developers. They're back of front-end developers. And we need to start to make this distinction.
That's a good point, because I'd never thought of it that way. But now that you make the distinction, I can start to see why some of the engineers I've worked with, kind of where their failings are, because we haven't made that distinction. I mean, just because someone knows Angular doesn't mean they're front end, right?
Totally. And just because someone knows front end Angular doesn't mean that they should be, you know, doing the back end of Angular.
Right.
Like JavaScript frameworks are great because they do a lot of the heavy lifting they take a lot of the back end sort of old school heavy lifting and bring it into the front end world, which is great, but they still back end orientated sort of functions and systems and processes. And like I said, as a developer, it's really hard to have a good handle of both the front of front end and back of front end. They're guys who can do it. They're people who can do it, not just guys. South African term there. Don't hold it against me. But you know, again, it's the idea of being sort of a jack of all trades or someone who's a specialist and actually can do a great job in a specific area. And the problem is, like, most developers who come into this space are more geared towards the functional side of things. They care about things working correctly, passing data, presenting data, taking users through the journey, making sure that everything happens in the flow that should happen in the flow, and not so much focused on how that flow flows and the experiences and what the UI elements look like. And this is where I think, you know, Batsy, what we were talking about in our last chat is, you know, where I think a lot of designers can step into this space a bit. And I think design systems, product systems, kind of open the door for designers to step into this, right? I think a lot of designers are scared about quote unquote front end because of the back of front end element, right? Because it's the scary world. But when it comes to things like HTML, styling, accessibility, animations, SVGs, theming, that's all design world, right? It's
Yeah.
all how, like, as designers, we think every day. People think about HTML and they get scared, but actually it's just structural components, like how you actually structure and build out the framework of, a component, a page, a template, whatever the case is. So switching your brain from structuring components in design to structuring components in a technical landscape shouldn't be that difficult. And it takes a little bit of upskilling to get into that space.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of tools that help us these days, right? You don't have to be this ninja code warrior to be able to do this stuff. And that's where I think, going back to, having this quote unquote storefront like Storybook and Pattern Lab, where designers can actually dive in a UI from a front end perspective and actually make changes, update things, tweak things in a visual manner, helps people get to the sort of front end sort of focus.
It's interesting you put it this way, because back at agency, we always had this concept of a creative writer and an art director paired, right? So you have copywriter and art director working as a creative team.
Yes.
And that yielded very amazing results, because you have two people that are approaching the same problem in different ways and coming up with creative ways to solve that problem. And I saw this when I was doing a project with my brother, and I am more of a front-end person. And because he has a history in back-end, he's a back-end dev, and he was doing the back of front-end Angular work. Yeah. So we worked as almost like a code creative team, because I would do all the heavy lifting on the front end, and he would do the front end, but the back of front end really well, because he was looking at it from a different perspective of, like you're saying, the performance side, how to actually make the journey work from a technical perspective, and linking that to the back end. So I think, yeah, it could be an interesting way to approach front end, in that we can create teams of front end devs. One person who is front end, and one person who is back of front end, and those two as specialists would work really well together.
Yeah, totally. And I think even the back of front end, can be multiple people often it needs to be, because there's a lot of heavy lifting that needs to happen in that space. But having, a front end designer, as I like to reference, like you might be a front end developer, but you actually focus on design. You're not so much focused on developing anything. You're crafting components, you're crafting UI in a technical landscape. I see. Do you want to maybe dive into some of the questions if there are any?
So one question from Uthman: what would your ideal developer for design system have in terms of skill?
So I think I touched on this in our last conversation, but again, that front end, I think, needs to be removed from technology. So it's great to have React developers and Angular developers understand front end, and they're valuable. But I think from a technology perspective, when we talking about design systems from product systems, I think we need to remove it from the system as much as possible in terms of the application system that we're working with. So skilled in HTML5, CSS3, JavaScript, jQuery, things like Bootstrap, have an understanding of that space. But I think, the demand of, hey, we're looking for a mid-weight engineer who's got 7 years experience with React and Angular and PHP and .NET, and like, that's not the requirement from a design system perspective, a product system. In my perspective, it's someone who values design, who understands the importance of experience design, and cares about the user experience at the end of the day, right? So that creating those magical moments on the front end, it's someone who cares about the process and the work and the effort that's gone into crafting the design for this thing, and pulling that through in terms of the front end. Because once we've got that sort of figured out from a component and layout, templates, pages, flows perspective, in terms of design to front end UI, that can then be handed over to the back of front end guys to tie into the application and make functional. But they're then not going to break the UI or the design or the experience, because that's already been done from a front end like technical perspective.
Yes.
And like we said last time, I think generally the people in my experience who play that role really, really well are designers turned front-end technologists. It's very rare to find a person who started in development with a technical brain who appreciates, loves design as much as designers love design and care about design. That's often where we get this sort of bashing heads of the us versus them in terms of design and dev.
Sounds like a mythical creature.
Look, they can be found. And the problem is, until we start having these conversations about the separation of quote unquote front end, no one's going to move into those spaces, right? The demand at the moment for engineers is you need to do everything. And the problem is, from an organization perspective and from a design-led organization perspective, the onus is on those people hiring the right people and asking for the right people. Until they start asking for those individuals, they're going to keep getting that generic developer. I'm not meaning to upset anyone in terms of my language today, but it is what it is.
Awesome. We've got another question from Sir. Wouldn't that be inefficient? Someone who understands front-end tech would save a lot of time and create exactly what's required by developers.
I hear where you're coming from, but I think that's where the difference is, right? I think front-end engineers should not be worried about development requirements necessarily. The whole role of a technical developer is to build a technical landscape to take in the business requirements, the user requirements, and the design requirements. And so often, and I've been in this position myself as an engineer, as a technologist, where it's like, ooh, building this thing is going to be really difficult. And I'm not quite sure if it's possible, if I can do it. So I'm just going to push back and say it's not possible. And that's where, like, I find often in teams and even at Nedbank is working with offshore developers who are the more back of front-end Angular developers, pushing back all the time to say, this thing's not possible, this thing's not possible, we can't do this thing. But then when you get a proper front-end engineer who understands Angular or whatever the application code is actually like, hey, actually that is possible, it's just difficult. Let's go down that road together, let's work at that thing. And also, like, a lot of those back of front-end dovelopers don't understand what things like CSS can do and CSS in JavaScript can do. And that's where they need that person who does understand that landscape of, like, okay, CSS is a design tool. It's not a front-end tool. It's not an application tool. It's that CSS is where we make all the beautiful things in front-end, right? And there's so much that CSS has to offer that most front-end developers don't know about, because that's not where they focus. They focus on the latest and greatest Angular versions and what's Node packages and modules and tying things and data sets and databases. So again, it's the same as asking a designer to be a designer of all design things, you know? So being, you know, sort of photography designer, print designer, web designer, you know, design all the things, and you have to be a specialist at all those things. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's not practical. So we've got a question here from Awada. How can you kind of make something solid initially before you start the project? Got any tips you have on like the basics of a design system that will be a great foundation for you to actually start the project?
Yeah.
So you don't have to redo things?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're kind of in that position at the moment with the Abu Dhabi project, where we're working sort of hand in hand with another agency who's doing design work. And we're needing to wait on that stuff for the system integration stuff from a design system, product system perspective. And we kind of spun a little bit at the beginning of the project thinking like, okay, we have to wait for these guys to be able to do anything because we don't have the visuals, right?
Right.
But then we got to thinking like, actually, a card is a card, a button is a button, an input is an input. We can start to lay those foundations.
Yeah.
And from my experience in the last sort of couple of months since I've been at Omnia and working this way and thinking this way, is it's enabled us to think about the core principles, the core foundations, the core fundamentals in terms of how components and elements and flow should work without the styling, right? So it's given us sort of a head start in terms of, and that's kind of what led me down this road, sort of the last couple of weeks of like this internal system that I'm working on to quote unquote white label a design system, a product system that has the framework and the fundamentals and the foundations that most projects in our world will need. Yes, the projects will need some customization and some extra things and that kind of stuff, but the core element and core system should be able to support a wide variety of different projects, and should give us sort of a leap into those projects, right? We don't have to start from scratch all the time. Even things like UX guidelines, documentation, templates, right? So the documentation isn't the same for everyone, but the template can be and the structure can be, and having those sort of ready to go for multiple clients, for multiple projects, and specifically in this greater project is a project within a project within a project. So there's always some way to start. And I would say start with those things. When we look at the sort of design to development and all the things between and what can we use and what frameworks and what technologies, it can get quite messy. And I think getting that sort of out the way before you kind of really kick off a project is super important.
Awesome. So we'll field one more question. Then I wanted you to kind of talk us through Figma API, Figmagic, and how that builds into a design team, its process. So one more question, then we'll jump into that. So what advice can you give designers who are working with front-end developers in order to kind of help them with this approach of creating components, variants, pattern, design tokens, like when you're working with FEs who've never done it before?
Yeah. Okay. So again, I mean, we touched on this in our last session, and it's breaking this divide between design and development, right? And that's why I think like got me really passionate about product systems versus design systems is from design through to production code, business, BA, product owner, stakeholder, we're all about the product. Not all of us is about design.
Exactly.
If we call this a front-end system or a technology system, then designers would be like, this is not a thing for me. So I think what's super important, Ishmael, I call him Ish, we work together at NetBank, is communication, right? So I think the problem is designers expect developers to know their world. Developers expect designers to know their world. So like I said last time, let's get into each other's worlds. Like we work in the same teams, we're part of the same product teams. Let's communicate, ask questions. Hey, how does this work in your world? Why, when I present a flow or a whatever, and the developer says, hey, that's not going to work, don't let it end there. Ask why. Get them to show you. Get them to make you understand these processes, because the more we understand of each side of the playing field, the less sort of disruption we'll have within our own teams. From a design system thinking perspective, not everyone gets it, right? It's I think people look at a material design or a Salesforce Lightning design system, whatever, and they think they know what that thing is. But that's why like these masterclasses are important. I think a lot of people need to be taken through the process of what actually is this thing. And again, back to the breaking down the silo of design system, product system, which is still a design system, right? I'm not saying that we need to change the terminology, but the thinking needs to change. From my perspective, and not from a design world perspective. Design world, we understand what design systems are in the design side, right? But it's the other side of things that actually, from an organization point of view, that's where the rubber hits the road. Creating consistency and alignment in design is great, but creating consistency, alignment in a code base is another level. Like that takes an organization from, okay, we're spending money on a bunch of designers to do a bunch of design, to actually this thing is now making us money, saving us money. It's hitting our bottom line. So that's where the shift changes. And if we can take what we've known from about 2015, when design systems kind of kicked off and is very focused on the design side of things, and we've seen the benefits of it on the design side. I think we're only starting to get into that place of understanding the value on the technology side and the code base side, because
yes,
it's always ended at design. And that's where my passions come from, in terms of let's break that cycle, let's start talking about product, and let's let these amazing tools and systems affect the end-to-end chain.
absolutely. Because you're exactly right that our users use our code, right? They interact with code, not Figma.
Totally.
All eyes have to be on the code.
Yeah. So this is going to be an interesting demo because it is extremely fresh. Like, I literally got this up and running last night after pulling all of my hair out, as you can see. But maybe let me preface kind of what's going on here. So coming out of NetBank, from Sketch to Figma, I've been focused on Sketch for a long time, and not really focused as a designer on design tools for a long time, but now diving into Figma, trying to understand Figma. I'm still getting my head around it. There's a lot that Figma offers, and Figma is amazing from a technologist perspective, which we'll get into, because they think, like, Figma as a design tool actually thinks about that end-to-end design to development to production code, and they care about that whole sort of tool chain flow, right? Because if things start,
the CEO is a computer science guy. That's why.
Yeah. The thing is, like, if things start in design and they end in design, what's the point? And that's often the case, right? We get our designs to a point where we're happy and stakeholders are happy, and then we hand it over, we throw it over the wall to development, and something comes out the end that might resemble what we kind of designed. And there's reasons often for why that happens, but we can overcome a lot of that. And I think Figma have invested heavily in that. So like I was saying, the thinking of this is, and this is super high level, it's proof of concept. I can't take full credit for all of it. I'm using stuff from sort of open source world. Figmagic has kind of opened my eyes to the fact that what I've been thinking is possible. I think there's a lot that can be done to take this further, and we'll talk about that. But basically, we'll go from Figma, we'll look at designs, we'll look at design tokens. People might not know 100% what design tokens are. We won't look at the API necessarily in terms of the technicality of it. So my cats are super keen to come and say hi. But we'll look at sort of how Figma integrates with our local code base, how we can integrate with Figma from our local code base, should I say, through the API, and see the power that currently exists and can be expanded on, and then obviously that flow into sort of a browser-based export of that. So let me share my screen again. Gotta find the right one. So let me know if you can see Figma.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So we'll start here. I mean, this is, as you can see from the heading, this is a testing area. Paratus is what we're calling our internal design system at Omnia. It basically, in Omnia, Paratus means prepared for anything, ready for everything, which I like a lot. And hopefully we can showcase a little bit of this to the world quite soon. But yeah, so starting in sort of high level token world, variable world, we've got some colors here with token names. If you don't know what tokens are, we can chat about that a little bit later. But basically, high level, tokens are like a variable that you can set within Figma that you can use in multiple areas. So set the color once, use it everywhere, update it once, it updates everywhere. And we'll just have a look at.
Does Figma have native token support now?
Figma doesn't have native token support. Well, yes and no. That's a very complicated question because how this is all working today doesn't use a plugin to export these variables and these tokens. Okay. But things have to be structured a very specific way in order for this thing to work from Figmagic's point of view. Right. They basically. So what the API is doing is taking a whole bunch of database assets or classes or titles and things and exposing it to the world, basically, and you can go and grab those things and do with them as you will. So Figmagic is basically doing that integration piece, grabbing the right things from the files, from the right files. Things have to be named very specifically and structured very specifically, which we'll talk about now in terms of its limitations. And that's why this is more a proof of concept than a sort of final hurrah. But it'll kind of show the thinking. So we've got a bunch of colors, and then I've just basically built out a basic component and a button and showed a whole bunch of different states. I'm going to go through this quite quickly and quite high level because I think it'll lead.
We'll just wait a couple of seconds. Might be a connection issue. I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. My whole external system just kind of shut down.
Oh, no worries.
Okay, the joys of technology. Let me reshare. Okay, can you see my screen?
Done. We can see it.
Great. Sorry for that technical interruption. So as I was saying, we'll go through this quite a high level because I think it'll lead to a lot of questions, and we don't really have the time to dive into the weeds. We can maybe do that another time. But basically, I've created a high-level component here, a default button with a hover state, a disable state, a warning button, and then an error button. Just for this demo, don't really have demo error buttons. And then you can see the color styles that kind of match to these design tokens that we looked at just now. Everything's going to be all over the show. So let me just, we'll dive into this now. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and then reshare the next screen because this application is strange. Can you see my code editor?
Yeah.
Great. So basically what I want to just kind of show here is I've got a blank project that has a source folder in it that has an index file, a utility file, but there's no other like sort of files in this application at the moment. This is a React project. React and Figma play very nicely together. So that's
as you would expect.
Yep. So let me, again, I have to stop sharing and resharing. Let me just share my whole screen. If people see what they can't see and not supposed to see, that's fine. Just for the sake of ease.
Yeah, what's the worst that could happen?
Okay, can see code editor again, correct?
Let me add it to the stream. Yes.
Sorry, okay, cool. Okay, so this is again the code base. There's nothing in it. It's a blank project. There's nothing in our source folder. So now what Figmagic does is basically it's an include in this project that you can run. You basically link it to Figma. You can see Figma, right? I just switched.
Yes.
Perfect. So through Figma, you can basically create, if you go into your settings, help an account and go to account settings, you can create tokens basically for different applications and then use that token to link to your code base. So that's basically your key to the API and to your specific document. So you get a Figma like API token and you get a Figma like project file token. And that basically allows you to point to this file. And then what Figmagic has done is they've basically created sort of a framework that goes and looks for specific things through the API. So it'll go and look for, something called well, anything basically in the token file. We've just got colors here. We've actually got a whole bunch of other tokens, but it'll look for different boards, it'll find colors, and then within that structure, it'll go and create these sort of quote unquote tokens. They're not technically tokens from a dev perspective, but Figmagic makes them tokens on the dev side. So it's pulling the data from the Figma API, not in a token format necessarily, but then it creates the token format for you inside of your code base. What it also does is it'll go and look for this elements page, and it'll go and look for anything on this page if it's structured in a specific way, and it will create the JavaScript and front-end components in code from the design.
That's incredible.
So as I was saying, there's nothing in this code base, right? So I've created this, I've created the design tokens. I'm going to go into my code base, and in my terminal here, I'm just going to run a command called npx figmagic, which basically says Figmagic, go and do your thing.
Figmagic, do your magic.
Exactly. So now it's connecting to Figma. It's gone and done a whole bunch of stuff very quickly, but it's basically writing a Figma base file, writing the design tokens, and then passing those elements. And if you can see here in my source folder, let me just zoom in a little bit. There's an elements folder and a tokens folder. Now in that tokens folder, we've got all of those colors that we created labeled the same as they've been labeled here: primary, primary high, primary low, alert, etc. Primary, primary high, primary low, alert. But what it's also gone and done is it's gone and created this button component in JavaScript, basically. It's created the storybook story for that component.
Oh, wow.
It's pulled out all the CSS, basically. So it's pulled in all of the tokens that it requires for this component. It's got base CSS for that, the default state, the hover state for default, disable state, warning, etc.
Oh, wow.
And then basically has a JavaScript file that basically takes those styles and styles to that button.
Yeah.
But now what we can do is we can run our storybook instance. To build out a storybook instance, there's the default button in its default state. It's a little bit tricky in terms of understanding. It's that button itself is just the base styles for all of the buttons, so it's not a specific button. So the one thing I need to do is go in here and just add in class name of default. That will update to the default button with the hover state. Now I haven't made any code, right? This is kind of all done on its own. But now the magic in this is if I go, now I've got my project open here, and I've got my storybook instance running at the bottom, right? So storybook is actually running, and if I go and change this to running and save it, storybook updates bottom right there, and in the browser, it's updated to the warning button. So if I just change this back to default, because we'll work off that guy. So it's back to default. So now storybook's running, I was looking for any changes, right? So if we go back into Figma, and we go down to our primary quote unquote token, and we change this primary to dark gray. Changes the token here, changes the default button here. And if I go to my code base and I run npm figmagic again goes and looks for any changes. You could see the storybook down here ran again. If we go back to our browser, that button has changed.
Wow.
So again, we've designed a simple component in Figma in a specific structure. We've created a React code base with storybook in it, with Figmagic in it. We've linked our Figma API token, our design file token specifically for that file, or our document, run the Figmagic command. It's gone and pulled all of the things that we need from Figma, even the code for those components. I'm not saying it's the best code, but it's functional code. And with Storybook running, we can basically have everything running live. Again, we can go back in here, change this to red. Again, just run this command, xfig magic. We'll go and fetch the changes. You see bottom right, Storybook will pick up those changes because there's something changed in the document. Go back to the browser, and that button's red.
Right.
Obviously, this is very high level. It's very superficial, but this can be done with basically any design token. So we can talk border radius, border thickness, font height, spacing, padding, line height. The sky is pretty much endless here, right?
Amazing. You can see the power of this once you have like a fully stocked out design system, like component library.
Exactly. So I mean,
amazing.
Yeah. So this is basically super high level, right? As I was saying, but the benefit of it is that a designer could do this, right, without having to. It's quite easy to set up this dev environment with Figmagic and with Storybook. There are a couple of commands to run. It runs on your local machine. The learning curve is very low. You don't have to know the ins and outs of React to do this. If a front end, back of front end, front of front end developer could get you up to speed pretty quickly. And then as a designer, you can be doing this stuff in Figma, seeing the outputted components in Storybook. You can then upload that to get. Your developers could be using that to reference as front-end components, not designs anymore from a component perspective. And the amazing thing is, you can, the possibilities are endless here. We could get into a whole bunch of other stuff here. Again, this is just a POC, proof of concept, to show that sort of live design to live browser component with one command.
So we've had a couple of people asking if recording will be available. Yes, it will. It'll be available on LinkedIn as well as YouTube. I'll share those links after this. Then we've got a question from Uthman. Do you implement any kind of branching with this kind of pipeline?
So you can. Again, that's the possibilities are pretty much endless, right? So I'm just going to turn this off because it's the possibilities are endless, and that's the thing. Is like I said, this is a POC. There's a lot more that can be done. I mean, at the moment, Figmagic doesn't take into account Figma properties, so that's why the components have to be like structured in a very specific way. That's not latest and greatest, and not the most efficient from a Figma perspective. But I know they are working on that. But again, those things can be developed by anyone. Everyone has access to the Figma API, developers, designers, whoever. So this is the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion. The benefit for me here is design things live in design world, technical things live in technical world, and they talk to each other. So there's no divide now in terms of, oh, I didn't understand that, or I didn't get this correctly, or the format was incorrect. Like the design UI elements, the variables, the tokens, like they import automatically. The developer can't say they don't have this thing, because if it's structured and set up correctly, it automatically comes through. And I've always been very weary of the design to code sort of tools, but this isn't sort of a design tool like Figma creating code. This is a piece of code connecting to Figma, talking to Figma, saying, hey, give me what you've got, then let me do the code thing because I understand the code thing. So the code can be as good or as bad as the developer creating sort of the quote unquote plugin to talk to Figma. So my sort of next steps here is, okay, now that I've got an understanding of how this all works and how it connects, is okay, let me dive into the API. Let me see what's available. Let me see how we can ingest information from Figma. How do we handshake properly? And then how do we set up the other side to be able to receive as much of the goodness of Figma as possible, to kind of take the front or front end away from back or front end guys. People.
Amazing.
Skills.
We've got a question, so we'll try and get through some questions because they're piling up. So first question is Uthman. So if you have a primary blue, like your primary kind of brand blue that's connected to a lot of components, but you decide to only change it on the button, is that possible? How would you do that? And I think it kind of links to my question, which was going to be, does Figmagic work with aliasing now? Like, can you create a token that references another token, and then you can only change that token, which is, I think, part of Uthman's question.
Yeah, so token aliasing, like I said, it's how Figmagic currently works. And again, like Figmagic is great, but I don't think it's a tool, for me at least. It's more, like I said, a proof of concept. It's something that shows the capabilities, but I think something else needs to be developed. And I think Figmagic might become that thing. But again, I'm not sure who's actually involved, how dedicated they are, if this is actually like a full-time thing. But I think from my understanding of what I've seen, is it's more like, we needed to do this thing. I wanted to show this thing. I wanted to play with this thing. So here's this thing. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done. Like I said, it doesn't take into account sort of Figma properties, which is how components should be set up in terms of creating variants. So if you go and create variants currently in Figma and create properties, it won't work with Figmagic. Figmagic will be like, what, you're smoking something weird, because it's looking for a very specific set of information from Figma, and it's set to receive that information. That's not saying that it can't be rewritten to receive different information. But in terms of nesting or sub-tokenizing your system, Figmagic right now doesn't support that. But again, it depends how your system's set up. How modular do you want it to be? You can be quite strict in terms of how your theming token system works. I always like to separate things as much as possible and make things as modular from the get-go. It doesn't mean that the application needs to be that modular. It just gives you the flexibility later. Because the problem is, if you start pretty strict, to make it less strict later, you have to redo a lot of stuff. So again, a lot of this sort of consulting work that I do around design systems or product systems is the thinking element prior to building the system is the most critical thing. Just building a thing to quickly do something is going to end you in hot trouble later. And always focus on a simple system, right? So like I was showing there, it's a simple set of buttons that does the specific things, but it does that thing really well, and then expound upon that. Gall's law talks about complex systems that succeed are generally made from smaller systems that were built first and then became more complex. Problem in our world, we want the complex thing. We look at Salesforce Lightning Design System, we want that thing. But that thing's been in production for 10 years and there's 300 people working on it. So, they started somewhere. We all need to start somewhere. We've got the benefit of the learnings of the last 10 years. But yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, those are good points. So is this possible only React? Like, what does Figmagic integrate with?
Yeah, so Figmagic is built in React. This is possible with basically anything, right? Anything that can talk to the API and receive data. That's the glorious nature of APIs, right? They're not technology specific. An API is basically just an endpoint to information. You need to have access to that endpoint in terms of the handshake, the token, and you need to know, like, technically you don't really need to know, you can query it, but it's good to know kind of what information is available at that API, how it's structured, how to ingest it. And that's where I think what Figmagic has done is, for me at least, exposed how that all works and how some of that stuff is being fed back. And now, like, again, Figma's really good in terms of their API documentation. Their community is really great. So like finding that information is not difficult at all. And they're pretty good at taking suggestions because they want a lot of people to use their product and they want their product to be the product that everyone uses. So I mean, to kind of give you sort of my high level thinking in terms of Paratus, the design system for Omnia is, again, going back to the removing the front end away from front end technologies or framework technologies. I want to keep the component technology side as tech agnostic as possible, and then using that as a reference point to build into multiple different technology landscapes and frameworks. So Angular, React, so using things like Next.js, etc., and trying to be smart in terms of taking sort of as vanilla HTML, CSS, and presentational JavaScript as possible. Because once you go down a very specific road, it's quite hard to then move across to another lane. But yeah.
Cool. So I've heard us talk a lot about JavaScript, Angular, React, but a lot of engineering teams here, especially in the UAE, work on native. So where does iOS and Android fit in all of this?
Yeah, so it's tricky, right? Because web technologies are web technologies and they're quite similar. Even if we look at things, I mean, in the UAE as well, like Sitecore, those kinds of things, .NET, PHP, they can ingest front end pretty easily. So you can take sort of web native, let's call it web native, sort of component library and move it into Angular, React, PHP, .NET quite easily, Java, etc. All of those things talk to each other quite well. But when it comes to device-specific operating systems and technologies, it becomes quite tricky from a component functional perspective because it works very differently. So, I mean, what we're doing at NetBank, and I think what they're currently still working on is sort of utilizing and leveraging a token system very heavily. So at least design is being implemented correctly and pulled through correctly into native technologies. What can be done in native technologies now, both Android and iOS, is you can basically create what's called an SDK that has a component library within it. And you basically nest that SDK within your application and reference it for its components. So you're basically creating an iOS
project
Android app that's not really a functional app, but it's more a housing for a whole bunch of components been built and structured that can be referenced inside of another application. And that's basically what we would call like a front end node node module for like an Angular or React component library.
Yeah, that's actually how we do it at Al Hilal as well. And it's a great tool because then our designers actually have access to that application, and you can see all the components you built and if those components are being built correctly using that specific application for sure. Sorry, so we tried to stream directly to YouTube, but we are having problems there. But yeah, I will upload and you'll be able to watch in your own time the stream on YouTube after this. So probably tomorrow I'll share the YouTube link. Cool. I think that is all the questions that we have at the moment. And Andrew, is there anything else you want to take us through before we sign off? It's been an hour.
Yeah. Geez, it feels like it's been 20 minutes, and I feel like
I know. It feels like we just started.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like I was saying, the design system masterclass that I ran at NetBank was like 4.5 hours, and I felt like I'd never be able to fill that time. Yeah, we can talk about this stuff a lot. And the problem, I mean, I'm passionate about this. You and I are both passionate about this. Like we all are. Obviously, that's why we're on this live stream and this masterclass. And there's so much we could dive into. But at a high level, like for me, like what I want people to walk away from is these systems, product systems, design systems, whatever you want to call it, like they need to touch on every part of the journey of your design. And that means all the way through to the code base. And from an organizational point of view, when we can actually take as design, be influencing code base in a good way, we're only going to make ourselves look better and give us a better platform within organizations.
Great. We've got a question. Did you do a course with the creator of Figmagic, or you learned to go by yourself?
So Mikhail, big ups to him. Hopefully, if he sees this or anyone mentions it or whatever, I haven't done an injustice or disservice. But I'm a hands-on learner. I'd rather get stuck in and fail a lot to learn quickly or slowly, because then that's how I understand it, right? I need to understand. So I'll basically start off with a base project, import things, test things, retest things, change things, tweak things. That's how I learn, because then once, like I struggle with the theory of things, I need to see the practicality. And once I understand the practically, if I do this, this happens. If I do that, this happens. Then I get theory for myself. I didn't do the course. I was Googling a whole bunch of things. This is what I want to do. Went down the rabbit hole of Google and Stack Overflow and all these things and projects and Figma plugins. And for the last 3 weeks, and got to a point yesterday, I was like, hey, this thing connects to this thing, works with this thing. If I do this, if I do that, then I get the results I want. So yeah.
Amazing. Cool. So question about micro animations.
Yeah, so Figmagic actually does like create animation tokens. So timing, all that kind of stuff is kind of included, but at quite a high level from what I've seen. But again, if Figma can give you the information, you can make it work on the other side. And that's what gets me excited about this, is it's the integration piece between the design tool and the technology. Because that's always been sort of this person handover, right? And it takes thinking out of it. And also, I mean, you can have a developer sitting on this side of the world connecting to a designer on this side of the world's Figma file, and it's a seamless thing. It's just getting to grips with the API and setting up correctly on the tech side. And from a designer perspective, you don't, and this is why, like, I think tools like Figmagic are great to test things and to figure things out. But I think, I mean, for us and for me at Omnia, like, I want to go build my own integration to Figma, because we have very specific requirements for how I want our system to work, because it's going to support multiple systems. So it's not going to be the same cookie cutter experience. And you know, I was watching a thing this week with Brad Frost talking about design systems and how frameworks are great, right? UI libraries are great. Component libraries are great, but they should be a starting point. That they should be getting your foot in the door, your feet wet. But all of our products, all of our teams have different requirements and different expectations. So I think it's really important that, you know, we start from a base of learning from someone else's work, but then really diving deep and making it customizable for us, so that it is kind of supercharged for what we need it to do. Because otherwise you'll be bashing your head against the table like I was for the last week.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks so much, Andrew. So any resources you think people on this call can look up if they want to learn integrations, how to connect design and code?
Sure. I'll send you I've actually got a list. I was going to go through it, but we don't have time. But links to Figma API, Figmagic, all of that good stuff. Talks from Brad Frost, articles from Brad Frost, lots of Brad Frost goodness. But I'll send to you, and you can post on LinkedIn and in the description of the YouTube video.
Cool. Or you can post and I'll reshare. And let's try to get Brad on this call. Hashtag get Brad.
Yeah, it's awesome. I'm sure we can make that happen. It's just the time difference thing that could be a problem.
Yeah. So our next call in 3 weeks or so is with a metaverse person in North America. Nice. So 6 p.m. UAE time is like 9 a.m. their time. So I think we can make it work. Yeah, we can make it work.
Yeah, that could work. Yeah. And then just to reiterate, like I said, I do work for Omnia. I want to plug Omnia. We're doing some great work, and we're looking for great people. So if you're in the market, if you're looking for something fresh, hit me up on LinkedIn and we can chat.
Awesome. Do you have an Omnia careers page people can look at?
I will send you the link to that. But a lot of the stuff that we do is more word of mouth in terms of recruitment, just because of the recruitment landscape at the moment is a bit crazy, and it's better to have that sort of one-on-one conversation. But yeah.
One last question from Ismail.
Always from Ishmael. He has to have the last word.
So on the front end and back of front end, how do you manage that in JavaScript? Yeah,
so again, it's not so much, we've got to sort of decouple that JavaScript framework sort of thinking, right? Is we've got to look at the UI components. So like in my code base that I showed you, is we had those elements, which are basically just components. And so the front end should be focused on those things, not so much the data integration, the complexity in terms of the application, like data pages, all that kind of stuff. The front end person shouldn't be creating pages. They should be focused on the the minuscule things from a design and UI perspective, and making sure that technology from an accessibility, browser support, all of that kind of stuff, that everything is hunky-dory. And then basically the back or front end should be coming in and using those components within their flows, creating pages, etc. So I like to create a bit of separation there. So there's sort of the front of front end JavaScript stuff, and then there's the back of front end JavaScript stuff that pulls in the front of front end JavaScript stuff.
Wow, that's great. Thanks, Andrew. So if anyone wants to know anything, you all know where to find Andrew. He's on LinkedIn. Just drop him a DM, and let's continue these discussions. I think it's a great discussion to have, and we need to get to a place where we can actually empower designers to start looking under the hood, right? Getting involved in the code at some level. You don't have to become a front-end engineer, but you have to at least understand how your designs are being implemented and have some ownership when it comes to the actual code that our users interact with, right? Which is the product itself.
Totally. And don't be afraid to have the conversations with your technologists around like how you'd like to see things work in your organization with your product. Like designers have greatly influenced the landscape of the technology side of design systems. Like without time, we wouldn't have that side. Without that side, we wouldn't have users using the design, right? So let's come together, have the discussions to say, hey, how do we make these awesome tools? Because that's how these things come about, from conversations.
Amazing. So this was well worth the wait. Thanks, Andrew. Glad you're feeling better. And thank you, everyone. Have an amazing weekend, and we'll see you on the next one.
Cheers.
Bye.